On the first half, we're fighting the Kenki trio. This is a fight that requires a good amount of AoE damage to defeat all 3 enemies at roughly the same time, so I'm using a reverse melt Rosario team, which is great for this. The first thing to point out is that the blue Kenki has 2 possible opening moves. One where he sheaths his sword and then dashes a very far distance in your direction, and another where he slashes you 3 times with his sword. Since we're trying to defeat all 3 Kenkis at the same time, the second attack is the one we're rolling for, since it keeps him close to us and to the other 2 enemies. Unfortunately, it's the attack that he opens with much less often. One way you can persuade him to use the 3/ opening is to dash to the left 2 times immediately after starting the fight, and then circle back around to start your rotation near the green or white Kenki. Doing this little juke to the left as you walk up to the Kenkis also seems to work sometimes, but it didn't work 100% of the time for me. If you are willing to restart the chamber a few times, this approach can also be useful since it saves a lot more time on your clear compared to the previous approach. The Kenki trio's attacks hit pretty hard, especially if you get hit by multiple attacks at the same time, but they attack slowly and infrequently. They also share a similar cooldown between their attacks, so a lot of their attacks come out at around the same time. Because of this, just one well-timed dash or burst animation can help you avoid multiple attacks at once. One attack that's worth pointing out is the blue Kenki's Cryo Explosion. Especially if you're using Bennett like I am in this run, the self-pyro aura that Bennett's burst applies onto your character allows the blue Kenki to trigger melt reactions on you and amplify his damage. Always be looking out for this attack and be ready to dodge it with a dash or a burst. You can also consider bringing a cryo shielder like Diona or Layla to help you mitigate some of this strong cryo damage. For most teams, this will usually hurt your DPS, so I recommend trying a few different setups to find a good balance between survivability and damage output. Throughout the fight, you should be looking for a position where you're facing both the white and green Kenkis while they're standing relatively close to each other. Once you're able to find this position, try to land your AoE attacks in between them so that they both take damage. The blue Kenki will naturally come into range since he uses mostly melee ranged attacks and follows you around. If you're able to keep the 3 of them together and hit them all with your AoE attacks, you'll find that each of them actually don't have too much HP and you can usually defeat them in just 2 or 3 rotations. Before we look at some other team comps that do well on this half, one thing I want to mention is that a lot of these team comps are going to utilize Bennett. Bennett is really useful in this fight not only because his strong healing helps us survive the high damage output of the 3 Kenkis, but also because his self-pyro aura cleanses the cryo aura that gets applied by the blue Kenki's attacks. This cryo aura slows down your character's actions and actually hurts your DPS quite a bit, so being able to cleanse this debuff makes a pretty big difference in your clear speed. Jean's Burst is an example of another ability that can cleanse this cryo aura if you have a team that uses her. With that out of the way, the first team we're looking at is a Melt Gaming team. Plunge team comps in general are pretty strong on this half because they cover a decent sized area with their attacks. Aside from this Gaming comp, Hu Tao or Xiao Plunge teams can also work really well here if you have them. The next team comp I want to highlight is an Overloaded team. Since Overloaded is a reaction that involves a large explosion, it's naturally a good pick when you're fighting multiple heavy enemies that can't be knocked back. Here I'm using a Raiden Overload team, but a 4-star Chevy variant or an Arlecchino Overload team can also work really well here. And while we're talking about AoE damage, Neuvillette is of course a great choice for fights like this. One thing I really like about Neuvillette here is that even if you get the quote-unquote bad opening with the blue Kenki, the way that Neuvillette's charge attacks hit enemies in a line instead of in a circle like most AoE attacks, it's actually perfect for hitting all 3 enemies even if the blue Kenki starts off a little farther away. If you have Dehya, a Neuvillette Burgeon team works really nicely here because Burgeon also deals a lot of AoE damage similar to Overloaded, but even a budget Electrocharge Neuvillette team can work just fine here too. One last family of team comps I want to mention on this half are Aggravate teams. Here I'm using a Kazuha Aggravate team with Beidou and Fischl as my electro carries, but of course you can always upgrade with Yai or Keqing based on who you have. This is another solid option if you're looking for team comps that can deal a good amount of AoE damage without depending on Bennett too much. Moving on to the second half, we're fighting 3 waves of enemies, starting with 2 Kairagi, and then 1 Mirror Maiden supported by 2 Pyro Gunners, and finally the notorious Fatui operative duo. To start off, I recommend steering away from Anemo or Cryo carries on this half since the operatives have higher res against those elements, and they're already extremely tanky as is. Hydro can also be useful on this half if we need to deal with the Pyro Gunner shields, but I wouldn't really say it's a hard requirement because they are pretty squishy regardless. Aside from the exact team that you use, the more important thing on this half is to have a strong grouping utility like Kazuha, Sucrose, or Venti, which is why I've opted to put Sucrose in the flex slot of this Nahida Kuki Hyperbloom team that I'm using for this run. For the first wave, the grouping isn't as important because they will eventually crowd around you anyway. You might notice that I'm not using my Sucrose's burst, and that is intentional because I'm saving it for the second wave where it's much more useful. The more important thing is to focus whichever one of the Kairagi has more HP so that you can kill them at the same time or as close as possible. As soon as the second wave spawns, I immediately throw out my Sucrose's burst to lock up the Pyro Gunners before they have a chance to split up. This buys a lot of time to deal with all 3 enemies at the same time, and ideally we're left with just the Mirror Maiden after our first rotation. When the Mirror Maiden teleports away, I like to reposition and attack her from the outer edge of the arena facing inward, so that the next time she teleports we're back to the center and we're closer to where that next wave is going to spawn. When the third and final wave spawns, again I immediately throw out Sucrose's skill to break their poise, followed by her burst to lock them in place before they can start any of their combos. This brief window right when they spawn in is one of the few opportunities in this fight where they're standing close to each other and are both vulnerable to CC. It's really important to act quickly and capitalize on this window to deal a good amount of initial damage right as the fight starts. One combat mechanic to be aware of is that when your character is marked like this, if you get hit by the Operatives combo that comes shortly afterwards, it applies Bond of Life and Corrosion at the same time. This means your character will continuously take damage until you clear that Bond of Life with some healing, so it is very important to take a decent healer onto this half if you don't want your characters to bleed out from this debuff. For the rest of this fight, I usually focus on the Anemo Operative since she is technically the ranged one, but the Cryo Operative isn't much easier to lock down, unfortunately. Throughout the fight, as I execute my rotations and deal damage, I'm also continuously looking for more opportunities where their poise is broken and they're being staggered by my attacks, which means they're susceptible to CC. These are the windows when I use Sucrose's burst again to try to knock them up and take advantage of the high fall damage that they can take during Sucrose's burst. These occasional instances of fall damage really help to speed up the clear on this half, so if you do have Sucrose, Kazuha, or Jean who can trigger this fall damage somewhat consistently, I highly recommend trying to incorporate them into a team that you can take onto this half. Looking at a few more comps for this half, most Hyperbloom variations like the one we just saw tend to do pretty well here. Even though the Hyperbloom reaction is more geared towards single target damage in most cases, the tracking mechanism of the Hyperbloom missiles work really nicely against the enemies on this half, which like to move around a lot. The damage output is also usually good enough that it makes up for the lack of AoE damage. The national teams are also quite good here. The high damage output of Xiangling and Xingqiu combined with an Anemo grouper that's typically included in these national teams makes for a really strong combo that's a perfect fit for this half. Here I'm showing a traditional Sucrose national team, but Child national and Kazuha national also work very well here. And speaking of Kazuha, most teams that have Kazuha in them will work on this half just because he is such a strong grouper and he can somewhat consistently trigger fall damage against those Fatui operatives. Here I'm showcasing a Virgin team featuring Nahida and Toma, which gave me a very fast clear on this half. And Kazuha Overload was another example of a Kazuha team that worked well for me here. Same thing goes for Jean, Venti, or Sucrose as well, like I mentioned before. It doesn't necessarily have to be Kazuha. As long as you have a team that has a flexible Anemo slot, I strongly encourage you to try to fit one of these 4 Anemo groupers in there, and you will have a much easier time on this half. These are all the tips I have for this chamber. The builds I use for all the characters I showed in this video will follow shortly, and as always, thank you so much for watching.